The stone corridors were never truly silent, even before dawn. Whispers clung to the walls of promises made too early, of crowns placed on heads too young to bear their weight. In the cold air of medieval Scotland, power did not arrive with celebration. It arrived with fear. A throne could protect a family, or quietly destroy it, across centuries shaped by war, faith, and fragile loyalties. A royal line rose, believing rule was a birthright ordained by God. Yet with every generation, the crown demanded more than obedience. It demanded trust surrendered, kin turned into rivals, and children raised not for love, but for duty. Behind public ceremonies and glittering courts, private doubts grew heavier. Kings learned early that ruling meant standing alone, as Scotland struggled to define itself against powerful neighbors and rebellious nobles. This dynasty became both the nation's shield and its greatest wound. Triumphs were celebrated in song, but failures were buried in silence. Exile, betrayal, and irreversible choices followed close behind each victory. By the time their power reached its height, something essential had already been lost, something no crown could restore. Their greatest success would also become the beginning of their undoing. Welcome to Dynasty Estates Chronicles, where we uncover the hidden stories of wealth, ambition, and rivalry that shaped history's most powerful families. Here we go beyond crowns and castles to reveal the human cost of power, betrayal, sacrifice, and legacy. If stories of royal intrigue and fallen dynasties fascinate you, like this video, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss an episode. Join us as we explore the truths history often leaves in the shadows. The origins of the House of Stuart were not born in splendor, but in service. Long before crowns and coronations, their power began quietly, almost modestly, in the shadow of stronger names. In the early 12th century, Scotland was a land still shaping its identity. Feudal loyalties were fragile, borders uncertain, and kings depended heavily on capable men rather than ancient bloodlines alone. The family's rise started with Walter Fitzalan, a Breton noble who arrived in Scotland during the reign of King David I, around 1136. He was granted the position of High Steward of Scotland, a role that placed him in charge of royal finances and estates. It was an administrative title, not a royal one, yet it offered something far more valuable than land or gold: proximity to power. Over generations, the title of Steward became hereditary, slowly transforming from a job into a surname. Stuart, later stylized as Stuart. Their early years were defined by loyalty and patience. Unlike families who seized power through rebellion, the Stuarts advanced by proving indispensable. They managed royal households, mediated disputes among nobles, and ensured the machinery of kingship continued to function during times of instability. This steady service earned trust, but it also planted a dangerous belief that their closeness to the crown made them natural heirs to it. Life in medieval Scotland was harsh, and the Stuarts were shaped by it, surrounded by constant threats from England, internal clan rivalries, and sudden violence. They learned that survival depended on adaptability and control. Faith played a central role in their worldview. Like many noble families of the time, they believed order was divinely sanctioned, and loyalty to the crown was loyalty to God. Yet even in these early generations, a subtle tension emerged. Service required obedience, but ambition demanded patina. Each generation inherited not only land and title, but an unspoken pressure to rise higher. The Stuarts were no longer content to serve kings. They began to imagine becoming them. This quiet aspiration, nurtured over centuries, would eventually lift the family to the throne. It would also lay the foundation for future fractures, as power gained slowly often carries the deepest fear of being lost. The defining moment for the House of Stuart arrived not through conquest, but through careful positioning at a time when Scotland was weary of instability. By the late 14th century, the kingdom had endured decades of war, contested successions, and fragile alliances. When King David II of the Bruce dynasty died in 1371 without a surviving heir, the question of succession reopened old anxieties. The Stuarts, long embedded at the heart of royal administration, were suddenly no longer observers of power but candidates for it. Robert Stuart, the grandson of Robert the Bruce, through his mother Marjorie Bruce, stepped forward as the most viable claimant. His claim was legal, widely recognized, and crucially non-threatening to the exhausted Scottish nobility. Crowned as King Robert II in 1371, His accession marked the first true triumph of the Stuart line. It was the reward for centuries of loyalty, strategic marriages, and restraint. Yet this success carried an immediate complication. Robert II was already in his 50s, with a large family of legitimate and illegitimate sons. Rather than centralizing authority, Robert II ruled through delegation. He relied heavily on his sons and powerful nobles to govern vast regions of Scotland. In the short term, this decision stabilized the realm and secured widespread support. In the long term, it created rival centers of power within his own bloodline. The crown was worn, but not tightly held. Authority became something shared, negotiated, and quietly contested. One of the most significant early decisions of the Stuarts was their approach to marriage. Alliances were forged, not only within Scotland, but across Europe, strengthening their legitimacy among royal houses. These unions elevated the family's status and opened diplomatic channels, but they also introduced competing loyalties and expectations. Royal blood became more valuable, yet more divided. Publicly, the Stuarts were celebrated as a stabilizing force. Chroniclers praised Robert II for restoring continuity after the Bruce line. Privately, cracks began to form. Power distributed among sons bred rivalry, suspicion, and ambition. Each heir believed himself essential, and each learned that authority could be claimed as much as inherited. The first successes of the House of Stuart established a pattern that would define the dynasty: survival through compromise, strength through alliances, and legitimacy built on patience rather than force. But beneath these victories lay a dangerous truth. By choosing balance over control, the Stuarts delayed conflict rather than preventing it. The crown had been secured, yet the cost of that security was ambiguity about succession, loyalty, and where true power truly lay. That uncertainty would haunt every generation that followed. With the crown finally secured, the House of Stuart moved steadily from cautious legitimacy to confident authority. The 15th and early 16th centuries became a period of deliberate expansion, as successive Stuart kings sought to transform inherited rule into unquestioned dominance. Power was no longer something to be negotiated quietly with nobles. It was something to be displayed, enforced, and centralized. This shift began most clearly under James I, whose reign marked a turning point in the nature of Scottish kingship. Having spent much of his youth held captive in England after his capture in 1406, James returned to Scotland in 1424 with a sharply different vision of rule. He had witnessed a more structured monarchy abroad and became determined to impose similar discipline at home. His authority was not rooted in affection, but in control. Parliament was used more forcefully, taxation became more systematic, and rebellious nobles were dealt with swiftly often violently. Executions of powerful lords sent a clear message. The age of shared authority was ending. These actions strengthened the crown but altered its relationship with the nobility forever. Fear replaced loyalty as the glue holding the kingdom together. While royal revenues increased and governance became more efficient, resentment spread quietly through aristocratic families who had once considered themselves partners in rule. The Stuarts gained obedience, but lost trust. Later, kings built upon this foundation. James II and James III continued the process of weakening over midi noblesse and drawing power into the hands of the monarch. Royal castles were expanded, court ceremonies grew more elaborate, and the image of kingship became carefully crafted. Authority was no longer just exercised, it was performed. The crown became a symbol meant to inspire awe, distance, and inevitability. By the reign of James IV, the Stuarts had successfully entered the circle of Europe's elite royal houses. James IV was a charismatic ruler who embraced Renaissance ideals, patronized learning, and cultivated diplomacy across the continent. His marriage to Margaret Tudor in 1503, daughter of the English king, was one of the most significant strategic decisions in the dynasty's history. It brought prestige and the promise of peace with England, while quietly laying the groundwork for a future union of crowns. Wealth followed influence. Royal lands expanded through forfeitures and strategic marriages. Taxation grew more consistent, and control over trade increased. The crown's presence reached further into everyday life, from justice courts to church affairs. Yet this expansion came at a personal cost for those who ruled. Kings became increasingly isolated from the people they governed. Raised in royal households and educated apart from common life, they learned to see Scotland as a realm to manage rather than a community to belong to. Religion added another layer of complexity. As Europe moved toward reform and religious division, the Stuarts clung to the idea of divinely sanctioned monarchy. Kings were not merely rulers. They were God's chosen representatives. This belief strengthened their confidence, but hardened their attitudes. Dissent was no longer just political, it was moral. Opposition became heresy, and compromise felt like betrayal of divine order. James V continued the consolidation of royal authority but faced growing resistance from both nobles and reformers. Though powerful on paper, the monarchy now depended heavily on surveillance, punishment, and constant assertion of dominance. Authority had expanded, but it had also become brittle. The crown demanded obedience without offering closeness, and reverence without affection. The greatest irony of this period was that the Stuarts appeared strongest just as the foundations of their rule began to weaken. Centralization brought short-term stability, but long-term fragility. By concentrating power in the monarch alone, the dynasty removed the shared responsibility that had once allowed flexibility in times of crises. Kings stood higher than ever before, but alone. By the early 16th century, the House of Stuart had achieved what earlier generations only imagined. They were wealthy, internationally respected, and firmly in control of Scotland. Yet the very methods that secured this dominance, fear, distance, and rigid belief also planted the seeds of future collapse. The crown had become heavier with each generation, and those who wore it were increasingly cut off from the human bonds that once sustained their rise. Power had expanded magnificently, but the cost of holding it was only beginning to reveal itself. The first true fracture within the House of Stuart did not begin with a rival family, but with absence. In 1406, a boy king was sent across the North Sea for safety, carrying with him the fragile hopes of a nervous court. The ship never reached its destination. Captured by English forces, the young heir vanished into captivity, leaving Scotland without its future monarch and exposing a dangerous vacuum at the heart of power. For 18 years, James lived in England, educated as a prince, yet treated as a hostage. He learned governance, poetry, and statecraft, but at the cost of belonging. Scotland ruled itself in his absence through regents and magnates who grew accustomed to authority without a king. When James finally returned in 1424, crowned James I, it was less a homecoming than a confrontation. Two Scotlands now existed, one shaped by noble autonomy, the other imagined by a king who believed order must be imposed from above. The initial conflict was quiet, but unmistakable. James expected obedience rooted in law and royal supremacy. The nobles expected negotiation, tradition, and shared rule. Both sides believed themselves rightful. Meetings at court were polite, yet strained. Old alliances felt suddenly conditional. The king saw disorder where others saw balance. The noble saw tyranny where he saw justice. Emotionally, the divide ran deeper than politics. James was a stranger in his own kingdom. His accent, manners, and worldview bore the mark of England, a country long feared and resented by the Scottish elite. Though Scottish by blood, he ruled with the instincts of an outsider. Every reform he proposed felt like an accusation against those who had governed in his absence. The first open clashes came swiftly. Powerful families were summoned, tried, and executed for alleged disloyalty. Lands were confiscated, titles revoked, and warnings delivered through spectacle. These acts were meant to restore royal authority. Instead, they confirmed noble fears. Trust collapsed, replaced by quiet hatred and watchful obedience. This was not merely a political conflict, but an emotional one. James believed his suffering in captivity justified his severity. The nobles believed their years of stewardship justified resistance. Both were right, and neither would yield. The rivalry that began here was not a single feud, but a pattern between king and kin, authority and tradition, control and belonging. It marked the moment when Stuart power turned inward, and the cost of rule became deeply personal. What began as unease soon hardened into open resentment. Under James I, the House of Stuart pressed forward with reforms that struck at the heart of noble privilege. Parliament was convened more frequently, not to debate, but to confirm royal will. New taxes funded the crown's ambitions, while old charters were re-examined, challenged, and, in some cases, revoked. Each decree tightened the king's grip and loosened the bonds that once held ruler and realm together. Public disputes followed. Powerful lords who had governed Scotland during the king's long absence found themselves accused of corruption or treason. Trials were swift, verdicts harsh. Executions were carried out with ceremonial finality, designed to teach as much as to punish. To the crown, these were necessary corrections, 2 years of disorder. To the nobility, they were humiliations proof. That loyalty offered no protection when authority felt threatened. As tension grew, the court itself became a place of suspicion. Conversations were measured, alliances concealed. Those closest to the king learned to speak carefully, aware that favor could turn to danger overnight. James's insistence on absolute obedience reshaped relationships. Advisors were chosen for loyalty over counsel. Disagreement was read as defiance. The monarch's confidence, once sharpened by captivity, curdled into distrust. Yet the conflict was not only external. Internally, the king wrestled with a sense of betrayal that never fully faded. He had returned expecting gratitude and unity, only to find a kingdom comfortable without him. Each act of resistance confirmed his belief that firmness was the only language power understood. Severity became both strategy and shield. In enforcing order, he sought reassurance that his authority was real. For the nobles, resentment deepened into fear. Even those who complied understood that survival depended on silence rather than support. Publicly, loyalty was displayed through attendance and ceremony. Privately, bitterness festered. Families passed down warnings alongside titles. Trust the crown cautiously, and never forget what it can take. The wider population felt the strain as well. Royal justice extended its reach, but often unevenly. While some welcomed the promise of stability, others saw only heavier burdens and distant rulers. The image of kingship shifted from protector to enforcer. Reverence remained, but affection waned. By the end of James I's reign, the rivalry between crown and nobility had transformed Scottish politics. Authority was clearer, stronger, and more centralized than before, yet it rested on fragile ground. Power won through fear demanded constant vigilance, and unity enforced from above left little room for loyalty to grow. The escalating tension achieved its immediate goal control, but at the cost of something less visible and far more enduring: trust. That loss would echo long after the executions ended, shaping every Stuart who followed. As royal authority tightened within Scotland, a different struggle unfolded beyond its borders. The House of Stuart did not seek power alone. It sought recognition. To rule Scotland was one achievement, but to belong among Europe's great dynasties was another. Acceptance by foreign courts became both an obsession and a measure of legitimacy. In Persing, the Stuarts entered a quieter, yet deeply corrosive rivalry, one between appearance and reality, prestige and belonging. Scottish kings were acutely aware of how they were viewed abroad. Compared to the grand courts of France or the growing power of England, Scotland was often dismissed as peripheral, its monarchy regarded as less refined, less influential. This perception stung. The Stuarts responded by reshaping their public image. Court rituals grew more elaborate, royal dress more opulent, and patronage of art, learning, and religion more visible. Kings no longer ruled simply as feudal lords. They performed kingship with deliberate spectacle. James IV embodied this transformation. Fluent in multiple languages and deeply interested in science, poetry, and medicine, he presented himself as a Renaissance prince. His court attracted scholars and diplomats, and his reputation abroad improved significantly. The marriage to Margaret Tudor further elevated the dynasty's standing. To Europe, the Stuarts appeared increasingly legitimate, no longer provincial rulers, but participants in continental power politics. Yet this growing acceptance came at a subtle cost. As the monarchy turned outward, it drifted inwardly, away from its own nobility and people. Royal priorities shifted toward how Scotland was seen rather than how it was felt. Decisions were increasingly shaped by diplomatic optics rather than domestic consensus. What strengthened the dynasty's image abroad deepened its distance at home. Public perception and private reality began to diverge sharply. Abroad, the Stuarts were admired for their ambition and refinement. At home, nobles saw rulers who demanded reverence but offered little partnership. The crown's need for recognition translated into tighter control, as any internal dissent threatened the image so carefully constructed. Loyalty was no longer valued for its sincerity, but for its usefulness in maintaining appearances. This tension intensified under James V, whose reign was marked by strong royal authority and increasing suspicion. He sought to continue projecting strength and dignity, yet relied heavily on punitive measures to maintain order. The monarchy's public confidence masked a private insecurity, fear that respect, once lost, could never be regained. Every challenge, real or imagined, was treated as an existential threat to status. Religion further complicated the battle for acceptance. As reformist ideas spread across Europe, the Stuarts clung firmly to traditional authority, aligning themselves with the idea of sacred kingship. This stance preserved alliances with Catholic powers, but alienated reform-minded nobles and subjects. Publicly, the monarchy stood as a symbol of divine order. Privately, it faced growing doubt about whether such rigidity could survive a changing world. The rivalry for status also reshaped identity. Scottish kings increasingly saw themselves as part of a broader European elite, rather than leaders rooted in a specific land and culture. Court language, customs, and values shifted accordingly. While this elevated the monarchy's prestige, it weakened its emotional connection to Scotland itself. The king belonged everywhere and nowhere fully. For the people and nobles of Scotland, this transformation was unsettling. The monarchy seemed more distant, more ceremonial, and less familiar. Respect remained, but intimacy faded. The crown was admired, not trusted. Kings were obeyed, not understood. The Stuarts had achieved what earlier generations longed for: recognition among Europe's powerful houses, yet the price of that recognition was a quiet erosion of belonging. By the end of this period, the battle for social acceptance had been largely won on the international stage. The Stuarts were no longer dismissed or ignored, but internally, the dynasty had suffered a profound loss. In striving to be seen as great rulers everywhere, they became strangers in their own realm. The rivalry for status did not merely elevate the crown, it reshaped the identity of those who wore it, leaving them caught between admiration abroad and unease at home. That fracture, once formed, would only deepen in the chapters to come. By the turn of the 17th century, the long, quiet tension surrounding the House of Stuart converged toward a single, defining moment. Years of careful marriages, cultivated image, and disciplined authority had positioned the dynasty on the edge of unprecedented power. Yet this ascent carried an unspoken question. Could one crown truly serve two kingdoms without tearing both apart? The stage was set by inheritance rather than war. In 1603, the English throne stood vacant, and the nearest legitimate heir was already ruling to the north. James VI of Scotland had spent his reign mastering the art of control-balancing fractious nobles, asserting royal supremacy, and promoting the doctrine of divine kingship. He believed deeply that monarchy was ordained, indivisible, and absolute. To him, the prospect of ruling both Scotland and England felt not only deserved, but inevitable. Preparation unfolded quietly. Advisors calculated titles, ceremonies, and legal language. Messages crossed borders, and courtiers rehearsed loyalties. In Scotland, the transition was presented as triumph, a Scottish king ascending to one of Europe's most powerful thrones. In England, acceptance was cautious, shaped by fear of foreign influence and religious uncertainty. Both realms prepared for unity, yet neither fully understood what it would demand. The stakes were immense. For the Stuarts, this was the culmination of centuries of ambition, the ultimate validation of their status among Europe's great dynasties. For Scotland, it meant the promise of influence, but also the risk of absence. A king could not rule the courts equally, and distance would inevitably become more than geographical. Privately, doubts lingered. Scottish nobles worried that attention, wealth, and favor would follow the monarch south. English elites feared a ruler shaped by a different political culture. James himself envisioned harmony through authority, believing that shared rule would smooth differences over time. What he underestimated was the emotional weight of belonging. Crowns could be united by law, but loyalty could not. As preparations reached their final stages, the moment took on an air of inevitability. There would be no turning back. The decision to leave Scotland for London was framed as progress, but it carried the quiet finality of departure. When James crossed the border to claim his second crown, he did so with confidence and celebration. Yet beneath the ceremony lay a truth few would voice aloud. Once the center of power moved, it would never fully return. The path ahead promised greatness, but at the cost of balance already stretched to its limit. The confrontation did not erupt on a battlefield. It unfolded in chambers, councils, and pulpits, where authority met resistance, not with swords, but with belief. When James VI of Scotland assumed the English crown in 1603, becoming James I of England, the House of Stuart stood at the center of two political worlds that shared a monarch but little else. The clash that followed was ideological, cultural, and deeply personal. James arrived in England, convinced that unity was a matter of will. He believed that kings ruled by divine right and that obedience flowed naturally from God through the crown to the people. This conviction, forged in the instability of Scottish politics, now faced a different reality. England possessed a stronger parliament, a more assertive legal tradition, and a political class accustomed to influence. What James interpreted as disloyalty, English elites framed as duty. Tension surfaced quickly. Parliamentary debates questioned royal finances, religious policy, and the limits of authority. James responded with lectures rather than compromise, asserting that monarchy was not a contract, but a sacred trust. His words were eloquent and learned, yet increasingly detached from the concerns of those he governed. Each speech widened the gap between royal intention and public reception. Religion intensified the confrontation. England was uneasy, balanced precariously between Catholic memory and Protestant identity. James attempted moderation, presenting himself as a peacemaker. Yet both sides felt disappointed. Reformers demanded further change, while traditionalists feared erosion of order. The king's insistence on control over the church mirrored his political stance. Unity through authority, dissent through discipline. Meanwhile, Scotland watched from a distance. The king's prolonged absence transformed what had once been anxiety into quiet resentment. Decisions affecting Scottish governance were delayed or delegated. Access to royal favour dwindled. The symbolic heart of the kingdom had moved south, and with it, influence and wealth. For many Scots, the union of crowns felt less like partnership and more like abandonment. James, caught between expectations, grew defensive. Surrounded by English courtiers and constrained by unfamiliar institutions, he leaned harder on theory than adaptation. His vision of unified monarchy became rigid. What he perceived as resistance confirmed his belief that firmness was necessary. What his subjects experienced was distance. This confrontation marked a critical shift. The crown now ruled two nations, but belonged fully to neither. Authority stretched wider, yet grew thinner. Every attempt to assert control exposed new fault lines between king and parliament, church and state, England and Scotland. The conflict was not resolved, only managed, and in that management lay its danger. By the end of James's reign, the illusion of harmony had faded. The confrontation had revealed a fundamental truth. Power expanded without shared understanding invites opposition rather than loyalty. The union of crowns, once celebrated as destiny fulfilled, had become a proving ground for a dynasty unprepared for the weight of divided rule. The immediate consequences of the union of crowns were subtle rather than explosive, but their impact was for what had been presented as a triumphant expansion of royal authority soon revealed itself as a redistribution of attention, favor, and power. The monarchy now sat in London, and Scotland, though still a kingdom, found itself governed from a distance. This physical separation reshaped politics, loyalties, and perceptions in ways that no proclamation could undo. In practical terms, the Scottish court withered. Nobles who once competed for royal favor now traveled south, following influence across the border. Those who remained felt sidelined. Their access to the monarch filtered through intermediaries. Offices lost prestige. Decisions slowed, and resentment quietly accumulated. Scotland had gained a King of England, but lost the daily presence of its own ruler. The crown remained Scottish in title, yet English in habit. England, meanwhile, experienced its own unease. James's belief in divine kingship clashed persistently with parliamentary expectations. Financial strain deepened as royal spending outpaced revenue, leading to repeated confrontations over taxation. Each disagreement hardened attitudes on both sides. The king spoke of obedience. Parliament spoke of precedent. Neither fully trusted the other, and compromise became increasingly rare. The cultural divide widened as well. James never fully adjusted his governing style to English political customs, nor did English elites fully accept a ruler shaped by Scottish instability. His efforts to impose unity through symbolism, shared flags, shared titles, shared rhetoric felt abstract in the face of practical disagreements. Unity was declared, but rarely felt. The longer-term consequences became clearer with the succession of Charles I, raised largely away from Scotland and deeply influenced by his father's theories. Charles inherited not only two crowns, but unresolved tensions on every front. He embraced divine right with even greater conviction, interpreting resistance as rebellion against God himself. Where James debated, Charles commanded. Where James lectured, Charles punished. This rigidity proved disastrous. Conflicts with Parliament escalated into constitutional crises. Religious reforms alienated large segments of the population, particularly in Scotland, where attempts to impose Anglican practices ignited widespread opposition. The signing of the National Covenant in 1638 marked a decisive break in organized rejection of royal authority, grounded in religious and national identity. What had once been unease now became defiance. The aftermath unfolded rapidly. Scotland and England slid towards civil war, bound together by monarchy yet divided by belief. Authority fractured along the lines of faith, law, and loyalty. The very union that had elevated the dynasty now magnified its weaknesses. A crown stretched across kingdoms could not contain conflict within them. The execution of Charles I in 1649 was the most visible consequence of this unraveling. It shattered the idea of sacred monarchy and exposed the limits of royal power in a changing world. Though the dynasty would later be restored, the damage was irreversible. Trust had been broken not only between king and people, but between the monarchy and its own history. Even after restoration, the balance never fully returned. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 confirmed what decades of conflict had already proven. Absolute monarchy could not survive without consent. The Stuarts lost the throne not in a single moment, but through a series of choices that prioritized authority over understanding, image over belonging. In retrospect, the consequences of the union of crowns reveal a profound irony. The dynasty achieved its greatest territorial reach at the very moment its moral and political foundations began to crumble. Power expanded outward, but cohesion collapsed inward. What was gained in prestige was lost in trust. What was won in crowns was surrendered in connection. The aftermath was not merely political decline, but an emotional one. Kings became symbols rather than leaders, distant figures bound by theory rather than relationship. The dynasty survived in memory, ritual, and exile, but never again with the unquestioned authority it once sought. The union of crowns had promised permanence. Instead, it marked the beginning of an end that could no longer be avoided. By the mid-17th century, the House of Stuart stood at a moment of reckoning. The battles that remained were no longer only fought with armies or decrees, but within the conscience of kings who could sense that the world around them had changed. Authority, once asserted without question, now demanded justification. The Stuarts, shaped by centuries of belief in divine right, struggled to understand this shift. Charles I embodied this final conflict most clearly. Where earlier kings balanced force with persuasion, Charles relied almost entirely on conviction. He believed that yielding authority would unravel the sacred order of kingship itself. Even as opposition grew louder and more organized, he retreated inward, trusting faith and principle over compromise. Each concession felt like surrender, not adaptation. Quiet conflicts multiplied. The king dissolved parliament repeatedly, ruling without it for years, convinced that royal will alone could sustain governance. Financial pressures mounted, forcing unpopular measures that deepened resentment. Religious reforms, intended to impose uniformity, instead provoked outrage, particularly in Scotland, where attempts to reshape worship were seen as both political domination and spiritual violation. Internally, Charles faced isolation. Advisors dwindled, loyalties fractured, and certainty replaced reflection. He interpreted resistance as personal betrayal rather than warning. Yet, even in moments of confidence, doubt lingered. Letters from the period reveal a man torn between duty to God and fear of disorder, unable to recognize that rigidity itself had become destructive. The final battles were swift and decisive. Civil war consumed both kingdoms, turning subjects into enemies and beliefs into weapons. When Charles was captured, tried, and executed in 1649, the act shocked Europe. A king, believed to rule by divine mandate, had been judged by his people. The moment marked more than a political defeat. It shattered a worldview the Stuarts had held for generations. For the dynasty, this was the ultimate reckoning. The crown was not merely lost. Its meaning was transformed. Power could no longer exist without consent, and kingship without understanding proved fatal. Though the monarchy would later return, the illusion of absolute authority was gone forever. In reflection, these final battles reveal a tragic consistency. The Stuarts did not fall because they lacked conviction, but because they could not release it. Their belief in sacred power gave them strength, purpose, and identity, but also blinded them to a world that demanded change. The resolution was not peace, but realization, arrived at too late to save the dynasty from its own certainty. Long after their political authority fractured, the House of Stuart endured through symbols that shaped memory more powerfully than law. Stones, rituals, and names carried forward a version of the dynasty that history itself could no longer fully sustain. These monuments did not merely commemorate rule, they preserved a belief selective, polished, and often incomplete. Across Scotland, royal palaces stood as physical reminders of Stuart ambition. Holyrood House, Stirling Castle, and Falkland Palace were more than residences. They were statements of continuity. Their grand halls echoed with ceremonies that once affirmed divine authority and royal presence. Even as political relevance shifted southward, these structures remained rooted in the Scottish landscape, asserting that the Stuarts had once ruled here in full. To the public, they symbolized legitimacy and tradition. To the dynasty, they became relics of closeness lost. Ceremony played an equally powerful role. Coronations, royal processions, and sacred anointings reinforced the idea that kingship was eternal, even when individual kings failed. Ritual softened memory. It framed the Stuarts not as rulers who lost power, but as guardians of a sacred lineage interrupted by circumstance rather than error. Public remembrance favored grandeur over doubt. Names, too, endured. Streets, institutions, and titles continued to reference Stuart kings long after their authority waned. James and Charles remained woven into historical language, associated with patronage of learning, art, and governance. Their failures were debated, but their presence could not be erased. In this way, legacy became layered admiration, coexisting uneasily with criticism. Perhaps the most enduring symbol was the idea of divine kingship itself. Even after execution and exile proved its limits, the belief lingered in literature, sermons, and royalist memory. Supporters framed the Stuarts as martyrs to a broken world that no longer respected sacred order. This narrative transformed loss into sacrifice, turning political defeat into moral victory. Public memory softened the cost by romanticizing the cause. Yet private truth told a different story. Within the dynasty, symbols often masked grief rather than healed it. Exile became a defining experience for later Stuarts. Courts in France and Italy attempted to recreate the splendor of lost kingdoms, but these were imitations sustained by hope rather than authority. Ceremony continued, but it rang hollow. The crown existed in name, not in power. One of the most powerful enduring moments came not from victory, but from persistence. Even after their removal from the throne, Stuart claimants refused to relinquish identity. Titles were passed down, genealogies preserved, and rituals maintained. The dynasty lived on in expectation, sustained by belief that history might reverse itself. That hope, however, became its own burden binding generations to a future that never arrived. Public memory often overlooks this cost. Romantic portrayals celebrate loyalty and tradition, yet rarely acknowledge the emotional toll of living as heirs to something lost. Children were raised to inherit crowns that no longer existed. Lives were shaped around restoration rather than reality. Symbols preserved dignity, but they also prolonged denial. In the end, monuments and symbols ensured that the House of Stuart would never truly disappear. They remained present in stone, story, and imagination. But these enduring moments also revealed the central contradiction of their legacy. What was preserved was not power itself, but the image of it. Grandeur survived where authority did not. The Stuarts became a dynasty remembered more for what they represented than what they ruled. Their symbols outlived their sovereignty, carrying forward a vision of kingship rooted in faith, ceremony, and inevitability long after the world had moved on. In that survival lies both triumph and tragedy. Remembrance secured, relevance lost. The final decline of the House of Stuart was not marked by a single collapse, but by a gradual narrowing of possibility. After Restoration briefly returned the monarchy in 1660, the dynasty appeared, on the surface, to have survived its greatest trial. Charles II reclaimed the throne, and with him came celebration, relief, and the illusion that the old order might yet endure. But restoration did not mean renewal. The world the Stuarts returned to was not the one they had lost. Power was now conditional. Parliament's authority had been affirmed through blood and conflict, and the monarchy could no longer rule by will alone. Charles II understood this reality better than his predecessors. He governed with caution, humor, and pragmatism, choosing survival over confrontation. In doing so, he preserved the crown but at the cost of its former certainty. Kingship endured, yet it did so by adaptation rather than dominance. The final rupture came under James II, whose refusal to accept these limits proved fatal. His commitment to absolute authority and religious uniformity reopened old wounds. Attempts to impose belief and bypass Parliament revived fears of tyranny, uniting opposition across political and religious lines. Unlike earlier resistance, this opposition was organized, confident, and resolute. In 1688, James II fled the kingdom without a decisive battle. The glorious revolution that followed did not merely replace a king. It redefined sovereignty itself. Power shifted decisively toward Parliament, and monarchy became constitutional rather than divine. The Stuarts were removed, not as martyrs, but as obstacles to stability. Their exile was quiet, almost procedural, an ending devoid of ceremony, yet heavy with finality. Exile became the dynasty's last chapter. From foreign courts, Stuart claimants maintained titles, rituals, and hope, but these were echoes rather than instruments of rule. Attempts at restoration failed, increasingly out of step with political reality. Supporters dwindled, memories faded, and loyalty became symbolic rather than practical. What remained was lineage without leverage. The decline was not only political, but personal. Generations grew up defined by loss rather than rule. Identity became fixed to what had been taken, not what could be shaped. The crown, once a burden of authority, became a burden of memory. Survival came through endurance, not influence. By the time the Stuart line effectively faded from contention, the world had moved decisively forward. Kingship itself had changed. Power now required consent, compromise, and accountability, qualities the dynasty had struggled to embrace. Their failure was not rooted in weakness, but in refusal. They could not relinquish a vision of authority that history no longer supported. The final outcome of the House of Stuart was therefore neither annihilation nor victory, but quiet displacement. They survived in blood, name, and symbol, yet lost the capacity to shape events. What endured was legacy rather than control, remembrance rather than rule. In this ending lies the dynasty's deepest irony. The Stuarts spent centuries building power through patience, belief, and ambition, only to lose it by clinging too tightly to the very ideals that once sustained them. They did not disappear. They simply became part of the past they had tried so hard to command. The story of the House of Stuart is not simply a chronicle of crowns gained and lost. It is a lesson in how power is built and what it quietly takes in return. Their rise was patient and deliberate, forged through loyalty, service, and belief in sacred authority. Over centuries, they transformed proximity to the throne into possession of it, shaping Scotland's identity and placing themselves at the center of British history. Yet every step upward narrowed their choices. Power demanded certainty, and certainty hardened into rigidity. The Stuarts believed deeply that authority flowed from God and could not be questioned without consequence. That belief gave them strength in chaos, but it also blinded them to change. As the world around them evolved toward shared governance, religious diversity, and political consent, they remained anchored to an older vision of rule. What they gained was immense: crowns, prestige, international recognition, and a legacy carved into stone and ceremony. For a time, they stood among Europe's great dynasties, shaping wars, faith, and nations. But what they lost was less visible and far more costly. Trust eroded, Connection weakened. Kings became distant from subjects, rulers from the ruled. Authority survived longer than belonging. In the end, the Stuarts could not hold both power and permanence. To preserve one, they sacrificed the other. Their refusal to adapt turned conviction into conflict, belief into isolation. When the crown finally slipped away, it revealed a truth history often hides. Victory and loss are rarely separate outcomes. They arrive together, bound by the same choices. The Stuarts endured in memory, symbol, and story, but not in command. Their legacy reminds us that power, once secured, must still be shared to survive. Without understanding, authority fractures. Without humility, belief becomes burden. History remembers their grandeur, but it also whispers of the cost. And in that whisper lies the enduring lesson. The greatest dynasties are not undone by enemies alone, but by the weight of what they refuse to let go.